Texas, July 1945. The 4th of July celebration at Camp Swift sprawled across the recreation grounds where heat rose in waves from packed earth and smoke from grills drifted through the afternoon. Among the German prisoners invited to observe stood 3 children, sons and daughters of captured officers, aged 8 to 12, who had known only rationed bread and watery soup their entire conscious lives. An American sergeant handed them each a hot dog, this strange creation of meat in bread with bright yellow mustard. They stared at it, uncertain, hungry, suspicious. What happened when they finally took that first bite would teach them something profound about the country holding them captive. The summer of 1945 brought contradictions that defined the war's aftermath. In Europe, Germany lay defeated and occupied, its cities reduced to rubble, its population struggling to survive in conditions that made wartime scarcity seem almost manageable. In the Pacific, fighting continued with grinding intensity as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands. But in Texas, on American soil thousands of miles from any combat, German prisoners lived in circumstances that seemed almost absurd, well-fed, safely housed, employed in useful work, existing in a strange suspended reality where the war had ended, but their captivity continued. Camp Swift occupied 18,000 acres of central Texas rangeland, originally established as a training facility, but converted partially to prisoner operations, as the war produced more captives than the system was designed to hold. By July 1945, it housed approximately 3,000 German prisoners, mostly soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy, and France, men who had expected harsh treatment and instead found something more complicated: discipline without cruelty, detention without degradation, captivity that somehow maintained human dignity despite its fundamental injustice. Among these prisoners were several families, a peculiar category created by wartime circumstances. Some captured German officers had been accompanied by their wives and children when taken prisoner, either because they'd been in rear echelon positions when captured or because the chaos of defeat had swept up entire household units. The Geneva Convention required that such family members be housed appropriately, which meant separate quarters from regular prisoners, additional provisions for children, and some acknowledgement that these were technically civilian detainees rather than military prisoners despite their association with captured enemy forces. The Meyer family fit this unusual category. Major Heinrich Meyer had been captured in France in August 1944, serving as a supply officer when American forces overran his position. His wife Else had been with him, working as a clerk in the same headquarters. Their 3 children, Klaus, aged 12, Maria, aged 10, and little Peter, aged 8, had been living in the relative safety of the rear area when the front collapsed, and suddenly they were all prisoners together, processed as a unit shipped to America, and eventually assigned to Camp Swift's family detention section. For the children, imprisonment was both terrifying and strangely better than what they'd known in Germany. They had spent their conscious lives under wartime conditions, rationing, air raids, constant fear, watching their country consume itself in conflict it couldn't win. Hunger had been their baseline, not occasional but constant. The gnawing emptiness that became so familiar, they stopped thinking of it as hunger and just accepted it as how bodies felt. They had eaten potato peels and turnip soup and bread that was more sawdust than grain. They had learned not to waste a crumb, not to hope for seconds, not to imagine what full stomachs felt like, because imagination without possibility was just torture. Camp Swift, for all its wire fences and guard towers, offered something they'd never experienced: adequate food. Not luxurious, not diverse, but adequate. 3 meals daily. Portions that satisfied. The slow realization that they might eat again tomorrow, that food wasn't going to disappear, that maybe their bodies could stop screaming hunger signals every waking hour. Klaus Meyer, the eldest at 12, understood their situation better than his siblings. He grasped that they were prisoners, that America was their enemy, that this apparent generosity might be temporary or strategic. But he also couldn't ignore the evidence of his senses, the American guards who treated them with professional distance, but not cruelty. Regular meals, the fact that his little brother Peter was gaining weight for the first time in years, filling out from skeletal thinness to something approaching healthy. Maria, at 10, understood less but observed more. She watched how American soldiers interacted with their prisoners, noting the absence of brutality, the way even casual conversations seemed possible, how some guards would smile at children or help her mother carry supplies. It contradicted everything she'd been taught about American savagery, about how enemies treated the defeated, about what to expect from people the regime had labeled as barely civilized. Peter, at 8, simply accepted whatever reality presented itself. He was fed, he was safe, he could play with other children in the family detention area. And sometimes American soldiers gave him candy or showed him how to play baseball with improvised equipment. His memories of Germany were already fading, replaced by the strange new normal of Texas captivity. As July approached, the camp administration began planning 4th of July celebrations. For American personnel, the holiday was important Independence Day, a reminder of what they were fighting for, an excuse for the kind of public festivity that broke up the monotony of occupation duty. For German prisoners, the holiday was meaningless, but camp policy included them in some celebrations as part of broader efforts to demonstrate American values and maintain morale among both captors and captives. Sergeant Robert Mitchell was 34 years old, from Kansas City, and had spent the war in quartermaster duties rather than combat. He had been assigned to Camp Swift in early 1944 and had gradually become involved in organizing recreational activities for prisoners' sports competitions, music performances, educational programs. He wasn't particularly political or philosophical about this work. He simply believed that keeping prisoners occupied and reasonably content made camp operations smoother and his job easier. The 4th of July celebration was his project. He had requisitioned supplies, organized athletic competitions, arranged for a military band to perform, and most importantly secured enough food to serve an actual American-style cookout. Hamburgers, hot dogs, potato salad, watermelon, lemonade. The full spread of traditional Independence Day fare, available to American personnel and, by administrative decision, offered to prisoners who wished to participate. The decision to include prisoners wasn't universally popular. Some American soldiers thought feeding enemy captives special holiday food was inappropriate, that prisoners should get their standard rations and nothing more. But Colonel Hayes, the camp commandant, saw it differently. America was winning the war. American values included generosity toward defeated enemies. Showing prisoners that American holidays meant community and abundance rather than militaristic display was its own form of propaganda, more effective than any poster or pamphlet. On the morning of July 4th, Klaus Meyer woke early in the family barracks, a converted storage building that housed 6 German families in separate partitioned spaces. The heat was already building, temperature climbing toward what would be a scorching afternoon. He could hear his parents talking quietly in German, his mother expressing uncertainty about attending the celebration, his father insisting it would be educational for the children to observe American customs. "They want us to see their abundance," Heinrich said in the low voice of someone who understood strategy. "Want us to compare it to German scarcity and conclude they're superior." "It's psychological warfare. Maybe," Else replied. "Or maybe they're just being kind." "Not everything is strategy, Heinrich. Sometimes people are just generous, because that's who they are." Klaus listened without revealing he was awake, filing away both perspectives. Was American generosity real or strategic? Did the distinction matter if the result was food in your stomach and safety from violence? These were complicated questions for a 12-year-old, but war had made him old before his time, forced to think about motivations and power, and the gap between what people said and what they did. The celebration began at noon. The recreation grounds had been decorated with American flags and bunting in red, white, and blue. Several grills had been set up, already smoking with cooking meat. Tables were loaded with food in quantities that seemed almost obscene to eyes accustomed to scarcity. American soldiers in clean uniforms moved through the space, some on duty, most just enjoying the holiday atmosphere. German prisoners arrived in groups, some curious, some skeptical, all hungry despite having eaten breakfast. The Meyer family walked together, Heinrich maintaining military bearing despite civilian clothes, Else holding Peter's hand, Klaus and Maria following close behind. They stood at the edge of the celebration, uncertain whether they were truly welcome or just being observed as part of some larger experiment. Sergeant Mitchell noticed them and approached with the easy friendliness that characterized Americans who hadn't seen real combat, who could afford to be generous because they hadn't been scarred by fighting. He carried paper plates loaded with food and offered them to the family. "Happy 4th of July," he said, then tried his limited German. "Willkommen. Please eat." The plates contained hamburgers, potato salad, and watermelon. Standard cookout fare for Americans. Unimaginable luxury for Germans who had been surviving on ration cards. Heinrich accepted the plates with formal politeness, distributed them to his family, and they stood there holding food that seemed too abundant to be real. Mitchell noticed the children staring at their plates with the kind of intensity that suggested they didn't trust what they were seeing. He remembered something about POW children having limited experience with certain foods, how years of rationing had created entire categories of cuisine they'd never encountered. He walked back to the grill and returned with 3 hot dogs, the iconic American food, simple but somehow symbolically important. "Try this," he said, handing one to each child. "Hot dog, very American." "Very good." Klaus took his hot dog carefully, studying it like it might explode. It was a frankfurter in a soft white bun, topped with bright yellow mustard and a stripe of red ketchup. He'd seen sausages before German cuisine featured wursts of all varieties, but never served like this. Never with such soft bread. Never with these brightly colored condiments that seemed almost cartoonish in their vivid hues. Maria held hers at arm's length, suspicious of the unfamiliar presentation. Peter looked at his with wide eyes, torn between hunger and uncertainty, waiting for his siblings to try first. Mitchell demonstrated, taking a bite of his own hot dog with exaggerated enjoyment. "See? Good. Safe. Just food." Klaus made the decision. He was the eldest, the one who had to test dangers for his younger siblings. He raised the hot dog to his mouth and bit down. What happened next was a cascade of sensory experiences his brain had no framework to process. The soft, yielding texture of the bun, nothing like the hard, dense bread he'd known. The salty, savory burst of the frankfurter, actual meat with actual flavor, not the mysterious protein substances that had filled German rations. The tangy sweetness of the ketchup, the sharp, acidic bite of the mustard. All of it together, creating something his taste buds had literally never experienced. Not just good food, but fun food. Food that existed purely for pleasure, rather than mere survival. His eyes widened. He stopped chewing for a moment, just letting the flavors settle on his tongue, trying to understand what he was tasting. Then he swallowed and immediately took another bite, bigger this time, desperate to confirm that the first bite hadn't been an illusion. Maria watched her brother's reaction and tentatively tried her own hot dog. Her response was more dramatic. She made a small sound of surprise, almost a gasp, and her face transformed from skeptical to amazed in the space of a single bite. She chewed slowly, deliberately, clearly trying to make the experience last as long as possible. Peter needed no further convincing. He attacked his hot dog with the focused intensity of an 8-year-old who had been hungry his entire life and had just discovered that food could be this good. Mustard got on his face. He didn't care. He was too busy experiencing something that felt like magic bread that was soft, meat that was juicy, flavors that were bright and happy, rather than bland and disappointing. Sergeant Mitchell watched the children's faces and felt something tighten in his chest. He was watching 3 kids discover that food could be enjoyable, not just necessary. They were tasting pleasure for possibly the first time, experiencing the simple joy of eating something delicious, and their reactions made clear just how much the war had stolen from them. Heinrich and Else Meyer watched their children eat hot dogs with expressions that mixed joy and sorrow. Joy at seeing their kids genuinely happy, genuinely experiencing something good. Sorrow at the recognition of everything they'd lost, everything their children had never known. The simple pleasures of peacetime childhood that had been denied by years of war and scarcity. Klaus finished his hot dog in 6 bites. He looked at the empty plate in his hands, then looked up at Sergeant Mitchell with an expression that asked a question he didn't have English words for. Mitchell understood anyway. "Want another one?" Klaus nodded vigorously, abandoning the careful dignity he'd been maintaining. Maria and Peter nodded too, their faces hopeful and hungry and unashamed in their desire for more of this miraculous food. Mitchell went back to the grill and returned with 3 more hot dogs. This time, the children ate them more slowly, savoring each bite, beginning to trust that the abundance might continue, that they didn't have to frantically consume everything immediately, because there might not be more later. Around them, other German families were having similar experiences. Adults who remembered pre-war Germany were rediscovering forgotten flavors and textures. Children who had known only wartime were learning that food could be something more than fuel, could be pleasure, could be an experience worth anticipating, rather than just a biological necessity. The celebration continued through the afternoon. Athletic competitions, relay races, tug-of-war, baseball demonstrations. The military band played patriotic songs that meant nothing to the Germans but had rhythm and energy that made even enemy prisoners tap their feet. Watermelon was served, sweet and cold and shocking to children who had never tasted melon before. Lemonade flowed freely, tart and refreshing. Another revelation for kids accustomed to water or milk when it was available. Klaus sat on the ground in partial shade, his stomach fuller than he could remember, trying to process what he'd experienced. The hot dog had been good, impossibly, wonderfully good, but it was more than just taste. It was what the food represented. America had enough food to serve hot dogs at parties. Americans thought frankfurters and soft buns with colorful condiments were ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of food you ate at casual celebrations without thinking twice. His family in Germany, his grandmother, his cousins, everyone they'd left behind, they were starving. Real starvation, not discomfort, not rationing, but the slow consumption of the body by itself when calories stopped coming. And here in Texas, enemy prisoners were being fed hot dogs at 4th of July parties. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But it also wasn't the Americans' fault that Germany had started a war it couldn't win, had consumed itself in conflict, had followed leadership that promised greatness and delivered destruction. Maria sat beside her brother, hugging her knees, watching American soldiers laugh and play games and eat food without the desperation that characterized every German mealtime. "They're not monsters," she said quietly in German. "No," Klaus agreed. "They're not. We were told they would be cruel. That Americans were savages without culture. That we should fear them. We were told a lot of things that weren't true." Peter, too young for philosophical discussions, was simply happy. He had eaten 2 hot dogs and was working on watermelon with the joyful mésanges of a child who felt safe enough to make a mess. He had sticky juice on his face and hands, and he was smiling, actually smiling, something his siblings realized they hadn't seen him do in longer than they could remember. Sergeant Mitchell approached the Meyer family again, this time carrying 3 small American flags on sticks. He offered them to the children with a smile. "Souvenirs," he said. To remember today. Klaus took his flag hesitantly. It felt strange holding the enemy's symbol, but Mitchell's gesture was clearly meant as kindness, not mockery. He studied the stars and stripes, this banner of the nation that had defeated his country but was now feeding his family. "Thank you," he said in careful English, one of the few phrases he'd learned. The hot dog was, "Sehr good, very good." Mitchell's smile widened. "You're welcome, son. Plenty more where that came from. That's what America's about, plenty. Enough for everyone, even former enemies. We believe people can change, can become friends. Today you're prisoners. Tomorrow, who knows? Maybe friends." Klaus didn't fully understand all the English words, but he understood the tone, the gesture, the implication. Americans believed in transformation, in the possibility that enemies could become something else. It was a radical idea for someone raised in a system that divided the world into us and them, superior and inferior, victor and vanquished. That evening, as the celebration wound down and families returned to their quarters, the Meyer children lay in their bunks talking about the day. Peter fell asleep quickly, exhausted by excitement and fuller than he'd been his entire life. But Klaus and Maria stayed awake, processing what they'd experienced. "I want to eat like that always," Maria whispered. "I want to live in a place where hot dogs are normal, where food is abundant, where you don't have to be afraid of hunger. That's America," Klaus said. "Or at least what America has. I don't know if it's like that for everyone, but they have enough to share with prisoners. That means something." "What does it mean?" Klaus thought carefully before answering. "It means they really believe in their ideas. About democracy, about abundance, about taking care of people. It's not just propaganda, they actually do it. They feed enemy children hot dogs at Independence Day celebrations. What kind of people do that? Good people? Maybe, or at least people who believe being good matters more than being victorious. They won the war, and they're treating us with kindness. We lost, and they're still giving us dignity. That's not how we were taught wars worked." Maria was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad we're here. I know that's wrong to say Papa fought for Germany, and we should be loyal. But I'm glad we're here, in Texas eating hot dogs, instead of in Germany, starving with everyone else. Does that make me a traitor?" "No," Klaus said firmly. "It makes you a survivor. It makes you someone who can recognize that the war was wrong, that what we were taught was wrong, that maybe losing was better than winning would have been, because at least now there is a chance to build something different." They fell asleep eventually, bellies full of hot dogs and watermelon, American flags tucked beside their pillows, children who had been enemies and were slowly, meal by meal, becoming something else. The 4th of July celebration became legend among the German prisoners at Camp Swift. Stories spread through the camp about the abundance, about American generosity, about children who had tasted hot dogs and discovered that the world could contain simple pleasures, even for defeated enemies. The psychological impact was exactly what Colonel Hayes had hoped for prisoners seeing American values in action, experiencing the difference between a society built on inclusion and one built on exclusion, learning that defeat didn't have to mean degradation. In the weeks that followed, the Meyer children's relationship with their American captors evolved. They learned more English. They asked questions about America, about how the country worked, about what life was like for ordinary people. The answers they received painted a picture of a nation that was imperfect but striving, that had its own problems, but also had principles about human dignity and equal worth that it actually tried to implement. Klaus began attending English classes organized for prisoner children, taught by a former teacher from Wisconsin who volunteered for the duty. He learned not just language, but history, American history, the revolution against tyranny, the declaration that all men are created equal, the ongoing struggle to make that declaration real. He learned about American mistakes, too. The camp teacher didn't hide slavery or the treatment of native peoples or ongoing racial problems. But she also taught about the American capacity for self-correction, for admitting wrongs and trying to do better. Maria joined too, sitting beside her brother in the makeshift classroom, absorbing information that contradicted everything she'd been taught in German schools. American children learned to question authority, to think critically, to believe that ordinary people could change their government through voting rather than violence. It seemed almost dangerously optimistic, this faith in democracy and human reason, but it also seemed to work. America had won the war, after all, and was now feeding its prisoners hot dogs instead of starving them. Peter was too young for formal classes, but he absorbed America through play. American soldiers taught him baseball, let him keep a worn ball they were throwing away, showed him how to make a glove from folded newspaper. He played with other children in the family compound, mixing German and English in the unself-conscious way of kids who don't care about national boundaries, who just want playmates and fun. By September 1945, when news came through that Major Meyer would be repatriated to Germany, the family faced a complicated decision. Heinrich would return to help rebuild his defeated country. But Else and the children had the option to stay longer in American custody, classified as civilian detainees who could potentially apply for refugee status rather than mandatory repatriation. The family discussed it in their quarters, weighing loyalty against survival, principle against pragmatism. Germany needs every able-bodied person to rebuild, Heinrich argued. We have a duty to return, to help repair what was destroyed. Germany is starving, Else countered. Here, our children are fed. They're safe. They're learning English and getting education. What do we return them to? Rubble and hunger? Klaus had his own opinion. I want to stay. I want to learn more about America. I want to understand how they built this. He gestured around, indicating not just the camp, but the larger concept of American abundance and values. Papa, I love you and I respect you, but going back to Germany means going back to everything that failed. Staying here means learning from something that works. Maria nodded agreement. Peter looked confused, not fully understanding the stakes of the decision. The compromise was painful, but practical. Heinrich would return to Germany alone. Else and the children would remain in American custody, eventually relocating to a civilian resettlement facility, beginning the long process of becoming something other than enemy prisoners, refugees, immigrants, eventually perhaps Americans. The separation happened in November at the Camp Processing Center, where so many arrivals and departures had been documented. Heinrich Meyer, still formally a prisoner despite his officer status, stood with his wife and children for the last time in an uncertain future. He hugged each child, starting with Peter, who clung to him with sudden understanding that Papa was leaving. Then Maria, who tried to be brave but cried anyway. Finally Klaus, who shook his father's hand like a man, 12 years old, and already carrying weight that should have been shared across shoulders. Remember Germany, Heinrich said to Klaus in German. Remember where you came from, but learn from America too. Learn what they do right. Someday, you might help rebuild Germany into something that has both German strength and American values. That would be worth the losing, if we could build that. Klaus nodded, throat too tight for words. Else walked Heinrich to the transport truck, holding his hand one last time, both of them crying now, because war took everything eventually, even families who had survived together this long. And then he was gone riding away toward a ship that would take him back across the Atlantic to a Germany that existed more as obligation, an opportunity to rubble and hunger, and the massive work of rebuilding from ruins. The Meyer family, now just mother and 3 children, remained in Texas through the winter. They moved from Camp Swift to a civilian facility in San Antonio, where displaced persons of all nationalities gathered, while administrators worked through the impossible logistics of relocating millions of people uprooted by war. Klaus continued his English studies with fervor, understanding that language was the key to everything else. He read American books, voraciously simplified versions of Tom Sawyer and Jack London, and westerns that painted mythological pictures of American frontier life. He learned American history, memorizing presidents and battles, and the Constitution's preamble with the intensity of someone who understood this was more than just academic exercise. This was learning the operating system of the country he might someday join. In the spring of 1946, formal processes for German refugees began. The Meyer family applied for resettlement status, supported by character references from camp personnel who had observed their conduct and integration efforts. By summer, they had sponsorship from a German-American family in Wisconsin who agreed to help them establish new lives. They arrived in Milwaukee in August 1946, exactly 2 years after their capture in France. The German-American community that was large and established descended from 19th century immigration waves, people who maintained cultural connections to Germany while being firmly American in identity and loyalty. The Meyer children enrolled in American public schools that fall. Klaus entered 8th grade, Maria entered 6th, Peter started 3rd. They were the only German-born students in their classes, objects of curiosity and some suspicion, children carrying accents and experiences that marked them as different. But they had one advantage. They could describe American hot dogs with genuine wonder, could tell their classmates about discovering what food could be when it was made for pleasure rather than mere survival. Their enthusiasm for simple American foods, hot dogs, hamburgers, apple pie, ice cream, was so genuine and unaffected that it broke through the barrier of suspicion, made them seem less like enemy children and more like kids who had experienced scarcity and were grateful for abundance. Klaus wrote to his father when mail service to Germany became reliable, long letters describing their new life. He told Heinrich about American schools, about learning democracy from the inside, about how strange and wonderful it was to live in a country where ordinary people could criticize their government without fear, where food was abundant enough that families threw away leftovers, where optimism was the default setting rather than defeat. He always mentioned hot dogs in these letters, returning to that 4th of July celebration as a turning point, the moment when he began to understand that America wasn't just wealthy but generous, wasn't just powerful but principled, wasn't just victorious but willing to share victory with the defeated. That hot dog changed everything, he wrote in one letter. Not because it was particularly special food, Americans eat them all the time without thinking twice, but because it represented what Americans believe, that there's enough for everyone, that even enemies can become friends, that abundance should be shared rather than hoarded. I had never tasted anything that good because I had never lived in a society that believed those things. Now I do, and Papa, I want to help Germany become the kind of place where children eat hot dogs and believe the world is generous. Heinrich's return letters were shorter, written on scarce paper with careful handwriting that conserved space. He described the ruins of German cities, the massive reconstruction efforts, the slow, painful work of rebuilding, not just buildings, but national character. He admitted that seeing what Germany had become made him understand his son's choice to stay in America, made him grateful that at least his children would grow up with full stomachs and peaceful futures. The years passed. Klaus graduated high school in 1950, attended the University of Wisconsin on a scholarship, studied political science and economics. He became an American citizen in 1952, swearing allegiance to the country that had fed him hot dogs when he was 12 years old and hungry, that had shown him generosity when he expected cruelty. He returned to Germany in 1955 as part of the Marshall Plan administration, working to help rebuild the German economy with American aid. He brought with him ideas about democracy and market economics and social welfare systems, hybrid concepts that blended German efficiency with American principles. He became one of many who helped transform West Germany from defeated enemy to democratic ally, from ruins to prosperity. And he always remembered hot dogs, not as food really, but as symbol, Symbol of the moment when he learned that enemies could show kindness, that defeat didn't require degradation, that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded. Symbol of American values at their best, generous, optimistic, believing that people could change, and that yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's friend. In 1968, when he was 35 years old and Director of Economic Development for Bavaria, Klaus Meyer returned to Texas for the first time since 1946. He visited Camp Swift, now partially decommissioned, but still visible in the landscape. He stood on the recreation grounds where the 4th of July celebration had happened 23 years earlier, remembering heat and hunger and the taste of his first hot dog. A local newspaper interviewed him about his visit, asking what he remembered most about his time as a prisoner. "The hot dogs," he said without hesitation. "I was 12 years old and had been hungry my entire conscious life. An American sergeant gave me a hot dog at a 4th of July celebration, and it was the best thing I'd ever tasted." Not because American hot dogs are particularly sophisticated cuisine, they're quite simple, really, but because it represented everything I hadn't known the world could be. Generosity toward enemies, abundance shared freely, the belief that people matter more than politics. That hot dog taught me more about American values than any propaganda ever could. It taught me that the country that had defeated mine believed in building rather than just destroying, in sharing rather than just taking, in tomorrow rather than just yesterday. The story appeared in newspapers across Texas, this former enemy prisoner returning to thank Americans for teaching him about democracy through hot dogs. It became one of those small human interest pieces that circulated through American media, reminding people that the war had produced not just victory, but also these stranger victories. Enemy children who became American citizens, prisoners who became advocates' hot dogs that became symbols of everything good about American ideals. Klaus Meyer lived until 2012, dying at 79 years old in Munich. Having spent his life building bridges between Germany and America, between European tradition and American innovation, between the old world that had failed and the new possibilities that arose from its ruins. At his funeral, his children, American-born grandchildren of a German major, told the story their father had told them repeatedly, about being 12 years old and tasting a hot dog for the first time, about learning that the world could be generous, about understanding that yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's friends if given the chance. And they served hot dogs at the reception after the funeral, this simple American food that had meant so much to their father, that had represented his transformation from enemy prisoner to American ally, from hungry child to grateful citizen, from someone who had experienced only scarcity to someone who spent his life trying to create abundance for others. It was just a hot dog, meat in a bun with mustard and ketchup, common food, unremarkable food, the kind of thing Americans eat without thinking at baseball games and backyard barbecues and 4th of July celebrations. But for 3 German children in Texas in July 1945, it was everything. It was the taste of generosity. It was proof that abundance existed. It was evidence that enemies could show kindness. It was the beginning of understanding that the country holding them captive believed in principles worth believing in. Sometimes history turns on great battles and treaties. Sometimes it turns on hot dogs served to hungry children, on small acts of generosity that teach larger lessons on the decision to share. American abundance with defeated enemies who would remember that generosity for the rest of their lives. Klaus Meyer never forgot his first hot dog, and in not forgetting, he helped ensure that the best of American values, the generosity, the optimism, the belief in transformation and second chances, continued to matter in a world that desperately needed those values.